Buongiorno, buongiorno e benvenuti a questa seduta.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Federico Rampini. I'm a correspondent of La Repubblica in the US, and I'm here to introduce and, if I still have time at the end, ask questions to the General Secretary of the OECD, Angel Gurria, who needs no introduction, especially so in Trento, as the organization that he's the Secretary General of has an important branch office here in Trento, and they deal with strategic issues as the opening to emerging countries, and is celebrating the 10th anniversary of the OECD office again in Trento. OECD means the Organization for Cooperation and Economic Development, and it has long been the club of industrialized countries. It has its headquarters in Paris, and over time, especially because of the thrust of Angel Gurria, this organization has changed a lot in that it widened its membership, the number of countries that are members to it, and that happened for obvious reasons. At the beginning, OECD included only the truly industrialized countries, accounting for 30% of the global GDP. And now it covers only 60% of the world GDP. Indeed, China is not a member. I believe that they are observers within the OECD in China. And Angel Gurria is extremely competent and has an important background in managing this growth of the OECD as it comes from Mexico. He was a foreign minister and finance minister in Mexico. And by the way, if I may, I'd like to open a parenthesis there. In Europe, we are a bit parochial, so much so that whenever you think about Mexico, you think about beaches in Acapulco and Yucatan, or drug traffic. In the US, where I live, the image of Mexico changed importantly. Recently, President Obama visited Mexico, and the whole of the US journalists talked about Mexico as a new emerging country with a very strong and powerful economy, another Brazil, as it were, an economic important country. So I think that we should update our knowledge on Mexico. Gurria is covering presently his second mandate. He was appointed in 2006, and his mandate has been renewed in 2010. And again, his main task has been that of widening the OECD. Today, he's going to talk about inequalities. And having said this much, I'd like to give him the floor. And I hope I'll have time to ask him questions. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And thank you also for what you said about Mexico. As a matter of fact, you should indeed update your knowledge on Mexico and Latin America, as it were. At the OECD, Mexico has promoted the inclusion of Colombia, and in 2015 also Costa Rica is going to become a member, and maybe at a later stage even Peru may join OECD. Also Latvia and Lithuania are potential members. I've also been asked to get in touch with people in Southeast Asia, so that the OECD can actually represent a global set of nations. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to be involved in the 8th edition of the Festival dell'Economia di Trento, and the fact of us celebrating the 8th edition implies that this is a very important festival. The subject for this year, sovereignty in conflict, is at the same time a bit of a provocation and and also a very important subject, as in a world as the one we live in, the role of governance and the ruling classes is becoming ever more complex. I'd like to grasp this opportunity to share with you what we think when it comes to global inequalities and potential solutions to the problem. 2 days ago, the yearly week of the OECD meeting was completed. The Forum of OECD was held in Paris together with a meeting of the Council, a ministerial council of OECD. The subject for today's meeting was "It's all about people, jobs, equality and trust." And I'm very pleased to say that one of the most important challenges we should come up against, i.e. the growing inequalities, is once again the top priority of politicians.
Of inequalities. Let me start with some facts on this very delicate issue. Over the past 2 decades, the OECD has carefully documented the evolution of income inequality. Actually, in 2008, we produced a big document called Growing Unequal, but with a question mark. Unfortunately, we have removed the question mark. This document called Divided We Stand has a subtitle called Why Inequality Keeps Rising. Now, the study confirmed that growing inequalities are in a way consolidating and identify the main drivers also behind the trends. Let me share with you some striking facts. Income inequality increased in the first 3 years of the crisis, up to 2010, more than it had in the previous 12 years. So this means inequality was already growing before the crisis, but nothing like a good crisis to get inequality just going through the roof. In 3 years, inequality grew more than in the previous 12 years. In 2010, the richest 10% of the population in the OECD countries, which are the more prosperous countries in the world, they earned about 9 times the income of the poorest 10%. So, a 9-to-1 ratio. Well, you say, well, so what? Well, the problem is that 1 generation ago, 25 years ago, the ratio was 6 to 7 times. This means this has increased by 30 to 40% in 1 generation. Clearly, it is moving in the wrong direction at high speed. And even for those countries whose inequalities have decreased, Chile, Mexico, we are decreasing inequality. Big success. Our ratio is not 9-to-1. It's 27-to-1. Brazil, 50-to-1. And they are improving also. So, here in Italy is 10-to-1. So, you're close to the average. United States, 14-to-1. It gives you any consolation. So this is a systemic problem. This is not just a problem of the poorest or even of the richest. It's all over the place. Why has this happened? Well, untangling the complex factors behind the widespread increase of income inequality is what will ultimately lead us to reversing the trend. We have to understand what is happening. Let me highlight 4 factors that we consider crucial in explaining the phenomenon. 1, the single most important driver has been greater inequality in wages. That means the greatest source of inequality is in the labor market. Of course, when you have no labor, inequality gets, This is no surprise. Among the working age population in most OECD countries, earnings from work make up about 3/4 of the total household revenues. So obviously, the sources of inequality come from there. Now, second, globalization, technological changes, policy reforms, they have also driven profound labor market transformations in all our countries. Relatively high-skilled workers have enjoyed significant earnings, significant income gains, while workers with low or no skills have been left behind in two ways. One, lower wages, but in many cases, in this period of high unemployment, out of the labor market altogether. The most affected in the crisis are young, male, low-skilled. These are the millions of the victims that have been increasing the army of the chômage, of the unemployed today. Now, the third element, policy and regulatory reforms have also affected labor markets. By promoting productivity and economic growth, these reforms have brought more people into work, and in particular, many women and low-paid workers. This is good. This led to a rise in part-time and low-paid workers, but this widened the distribution of wages. It made the distances higher. I have to say, normally you take a look at part-time work as if it were some kind of inferior, but it is the secret of the success of many countries, because this is the way to bring in the women, this is the way to bring in the elderly, this is the way to bring in more of the young people, rather than having very rigid 9-hour shifts or 7-hour shifts in the country where we come from, not Mexico, but
France.
Yes, now, last but not least, tax benefit systems have become less effective at redistributing incomes. The main reason of this is that is on the benefit side. Levels of benefits have been cut, and eligibility rules have been tightened to contain social spending as a response to the crisis, to the budgetary problems. So transfers to the lowest income groups have failed to keep pace with the earnings growth. You have high inequality, you add taxes, you add social security, and you end up much lower inequality. Here, the tax system and the social security system is now less effective at reducing inequalities. This is what this says. So once we have identified the roots of the problem, what do we do? What do we do? How do we reverse the trend? Well, today more than ever, the key to reversing the inequality trend lies clearly in improving the employment situation. Unemployment during the crisis has reached unprecedented levels. We currently have close to 49 million people unemployed in the OECD area only. Of course, at the world level, it's about more than 200 million, but it's very difficult to calculate because in India, 90% of the workforce is informal. Even in Brazil or in Mexico, 60% of the workforce is informal. So it's very difficult to track unemployment as such because you don't have unemployment benefits and you don't have the statistics, etc. But only on the OECD, where we do have the tracking systems, where we can follow the numbers, you are talking about 49 million people. Now, is this high or low? Because you're talking about 34 countries, you're talking about 60% of world GDP. Well, the problem is this 14 million more than before the crisis. That gives you an idea of the severity. The young have been particularly affected. They represent 16.5%. 16.5% of them, of the young, are out of work. Well, because the average in the OECD is 8. This does not sound so bad. 8. Of course, this heights average euro area 12.2%, 12.3%. United States 7.5%, improving. Japan always has very low levels. It's about 5%, a little low. So the average obscures the reality. But for the young, everywhere, double triple, quadruple the average of the country. This is invariable, whether it's the United States, whether it's Spain, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Mexico. So now, Greece and Spain, I was saying 50%. In Italy, your unemployment rate is 11.5. This is the average. Again, this masks the fact that your youth unemployment now is about 38.4%. 3 times more. Not the usual double, but 3 times more. We need to urgently focus on creating more and better jobs and on offering real career prospects for these young people. We must, for example, focus on upskilling the workforce, removing barriers to higher labor force participation of the women, strengthening gender equality, and focusing on the question of employability, not only on employment, but employability, because the skills are portable, whether the job is not so portable. In fact, in Europe, you have very little mobility of the labor force because of the housing situation, because, you know, typically you live in the United States. It used to be, it's not longer the case, but it used to be until before the crisis, that you change job, you sell the house, then you go to Cincinnati, you buy the house in there, you go to the new job. 2 years later, you get a job offer in Chicago. You sell the house in Cincinnati. You move to Chicago. This was the way this. It's a culture. It's a part. And the market's allowed. There's a housing market, but also the job market. Whereas in Europe, the mobility is very, very little. Sometimes you have very good job opportunities, and maybe sometimes even you are in Trento and the opportunities are in Venice, and you don't move. It's this very short distance. Even more, now there's a little bit more mobility forced by the crisis across borders. But this is not typical. This is another problem. Now, the provision of public services such as education and health is also essential in reducing inequality. Improving the quality of these services, particularly, I would say, education and health, is therefore crucial. In the PISA is something we organize every 3 years, 70 countries in the world, now includes China, India, etc., is a program for international student assessment. This is the most recognized system to compare the relative effectiveness of education systems in the world. The OECD provides a powerful tool to assess the quality of education and the experience of 34 OECD member states, yes, but also 37 other non-member states. We call member states that participate. And it suggests which and how are the finer points and why, regardless of whether it is China or Finland or Canada or Korea, with completely different governance, political issues, cultural issues, there are certain common trends to the successful systems, to the ones that are at the top, even if they're very different in nature. So again, let's take a hard look. There are elements. We have the way to take a look at the X-ray. You know, actually, from the X-ray, we're passing to the PET scan. We can now have very, very defined, very specific look inside this phenomena. The reform of tax and benefit policies, also very central to our role, to our goals. Over the last 2 decades, many countries moved away from highly progressive income tax rates and net wealth taxes. Viable and effective policy avenues do exist. Raising some marginal tax rates, certainly on the highest income brackets. Just don't overdo it, because then you lose your citizens. Some people want to go to Russia for some reason. Improving tax compliance, eliminating tax exemption, reassessing the roles of things like property taxes. In fact, today, you say, well, what do you do? What do you do, the tax policy? You're talking about eliminating the inequalities, etc. What is tax policy today generally happening in the world? Basically, you're saying, reduce the tax on labor. And that includes tax directly on labor, on the wage earners, but also on the companies, but also reduce the social security contribution. Why? Because if you make it more expensive, in Europe, in many countries, you take away almost 50% of the workers' wages in different charges. It's so expensive to create a new job. Result, nobody wants to create new jobs. You take away the appetite per l'imprenditore, to create a new job. But then lower the wages, lower the taxes on the companies. You say, but GURRIA, please, we are trying to square the balance. No, il fabbisogno. You're talking about reducing the taxes. It's almost the counter logic. We say, yes, but what are they doing to compensate? Increasing the value added. This is not a message to anybody anywhere in the government here or anything like that. I'm just saying what the world is doing. Increasing the taxes on property. Again, this message we have delivered directly to the government only a few days ago, so it's not in order to be provocative here. But and the third is to increase the taxes on emissions, the green taxes. This is a way you compensate by the loss of the revenue on companies and on labor to incentivize the creation of more investment and more jobs in order to get greater equality. Now, the OECD is actively engaged in supporting its member and partner countries in addressing the high levels of inequality and promoting equality of opportunities. Last week, our ministerial endorsed a youth action plan. It contains concrete actions to increase job opportunities and the employability of the youth by improving education, vocational education, training systems, as well as ensuring better transition from the school to the work. Sometimes now you never give that step. You always stay in the school and then you go to unemployed, which of course is a tragedy. It's part of this problem of losing a whole generation. And obviously unacceptable as a proposition. Economic, moral, ethical, political, absolutely unacceptable and unsustainable. We are developing a strategy for inclusive growth. The word inclusive is of the essence, which focuses not only on income and wealth, but also on non-monetary dimensions. Jobs, education, health, social connection, civic engagement, institutions. We actually are the institution that has created the tool to measure the Better Life Index, the beyond GDP, the non-GDP related dimensions of the quality of life, precisely to be able to provide this input on the policy side, not intuitive, not creative, but basically measuring and benchmarking. We're also focusing on gender equality. Last year we launched a report, Closing the Gender Gap. Act now. This report identifies the main trends behind the gender gaps and provides policy options to close them. And during our ministerial of 2 days ago, we adopted a recommendation on gender equality, focusing on the 3 E's: education, employment, and entrepreneurship. Again, this is to reduce the inequalities. So, obviously here, measuring is critical, but evaluation as we go along is also very important. Lastly, let me highlight an ambitious, multifaceted initiative we have embarked on. We call it New Approaches to Economic Challenges, NAEC. Sometimes people think we're making publicity to some tennis shoes or something like that. But it's not tennis shoes. This is, and it's policy-oriented, which means we did not call it new economic thinking, because it's not only about thinking, it's policy-oriented. It's about telling governments what policies to embark on. And it's basically also mea culpa, because mostly you, the youngest here, you have to understand, we at the international organization do not feel very proud of our role in the crisis. We were discussing, we were talking, and there was a train, a freight train coming down the line, going boo, boo, boo. It was very clear the train was coming, and we were playing cards in the rails. And then, of course, and then everybody's kind of waking up. We are still in the crisis. We did not talk enough among ourselves. The IMF was told by shareholders, dedicate yourself to the external sector, the finance crisis, and the World Bank was told to dedicate to fight against poverty, and the OECD was told to dedicate itself to structural issues, and the ILO to talk only about labor, and the WTO to talk only about the Doha round, or not the Doha round, or the non-Doha round, whatever it is. No? So we did not cross-pollinate, we did not cross-fertilize enough. And of course, we could not become a formidable choir with a united voice to tell our shareholders, watch it. The train is coming, you know. Do whatever it takes. We at least could have avoided the very serious damages. So we have to organize ourselves better. This is new approaches to economic challenges. It's a challenge to look at self in the mirror, naked. And of course, we don't like it very much. And then see, okay, how can we do better? Huh? So, again, this is about the governance of the world, of the economic policies, not only about the question of one sector, the other sector, or one individual institution. This is something that has to be corrected. Signore, signori, le disuguaglianze minacciano la vitalità delle nostre economie, erodono la fiducia sociale.
Citizens, again, are rejecting the strength of social compact. It's important to trigger growth and create jobs. And this is obviously our major priorities, which need to be developed in a sustainable and inclusive manner. And I was being asked by the press, for example, when we launched the economic report about Italy to Mr. Letta in Rome in 2 to 3 weeks ago. I mean, he had been selected only maybe a couple of days before, and we gave them the most important recommendation for Italy, and the answer is action, 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 implementation. It's absolutely necessary to implement.
Make sure you don't go back, but at the same time, of course, continue with the reforms, continue to the reforms. Reforms are not a one-time, reforms are a state of mind. Reforms, you know, society has to be ready constantly to be discussing and promoting and supporting reforms.
In order to attain such goal, we need to guarantee a safe job to young people as they deserve it, which is thanks to our fiscal policies. All taxpayers will have to pay their taxes. And then gender equality should never be discussed at the workplace, and everybody should draw benefit from an economic growth in the future. The OECD is making all possible efforts to help member states and partners to reach such objectives. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you to Angel Gurria. Thank you very much. As this applause demonstrates, one of the advantages of having Latin blood in one's own veins is that you can talk about very serious stuff, very important things, even dramatic ones, with a lot of passion, which actually conveys the concepts easily. Besides the very good pronunciation of our language, we should force the General Secretary of the OECD to speak Italian at all times. But anyway, in preparing my first question, I simply would like to transfer ourselves to a different historical era, because a debate on the same issue, i.e. inequalities and globalization, had we discussed this, say, 15 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, but certainly 15 years ago, we would have followed a totally different path. I mean, probably I'm referring here to a very specific time when between 1999 and the year 2000. I don't know whether this reminds me of something, the birth of the World Trade Organization or clashes in Seattle against globalization, for example. I, at that time, was an observer, was a journalist based in California, and I was following U.S. delegations going to China for the latest phases of negotiations to allow China to become part of the WTO. And the idea then was that globalization would have widened inequalities between nations, between North and the South, rather than within each single nation. And many Chinese managers were convinced about this. In the Chinese leadership, there was a very, very lively debate because part of the party, say the leftists of the People's Republic's party in China, thought that, the Chinese would be colonized by the Americans, that they would have been devoured by the US, that the rich countries would win over everybody else. And today, instead, we find ourselves with the same issue. And this topic, inequalities and globalization, is mainly meant as inequalities within each single nation, because many emerging countries, in fact, got closer to us, and divergences between the North and the South, in fact, decreased. Sometimes it's useless to make a step back and think about the fact that we had a totally different view of the world and things then moved differently. But this is basically an issue you've already tackled during your report. But I'd like to go back to one aspect of it, because you explained how globalization can be a factor to worsen inequalities within our countries. And more specifically, you said that it has a very strong impact on the labor force, which are obviously more prone to suffering from competition. This is obvious. If a worker works in a sector that can be outsourced and in China, the risk for his salary to be cut or the risk for him to lose his job obviously increases. But I mean, today we have counterexamples. Germany, for example, is one of the European countries with the lowest unemployment rate, and in fact with a lower youth unemployment rate, very, very low. In fact, youth unemployment rate in Germany is even lower than in the US. And its trade balance is active vis-à-vis China. So it's a country which is, in fact, thriving with globalization, with high salaries, high wages. I mean, you wouldn't say that it is unavoidable for globalization to lead to a weakening of the weak, impoverishing the workers, because some, in fact, avoided this. Germany, for example.
This is probably the most important consideration of the process of globalization. First of all, globalization is not an option. Globalization is a reality which you can get on or be run over by. So it's better, maybe, intuitively, to be inside looking through the window than under the rail, no? It's not going to stop because somebody is not prepared. The ones who are better prepared are going to profit from the broader cake. There's a bigger reward out there because of globalization, but it's not going to be shared in the same way as wealth today. You mentioned correctly there are several phenomena. One is shifting wealth, okay? OECD was 80% of the world GDP when we were created, and we added membership. Today, the same membership, if we stay, in 20 or 30 years' time, will probably be less than half of the world GDP. Because they're shifting wealth in China and India and Brazil, and the developing countries are going to take a larger and larger. Africa is growing much faster, etc. But the problem is the following. How do you take advantage of globalization? And you mentioned Germany. Everybody talks about Germany in different ways, but it's an interesting example. What creates competitiveness? Well, let me tell you that we recently, Piercarlo Padoan is a very distinguished Italian here, and who is the Deputy Secretary General, a chief economist. He created a very famous graph which we call the crocodile, because it has unit labor cost. What is unit labor cost? It's simply the cost of labor, you know, but also it includes the time that you work and how much you produce per hour, etc. So it's a measure of relative cost of labor. Last 12 years, it's a long period. Italy, from 100 to maybe 130, 140. France, Greece, even higher. Ireland, Portugal, etc. 130, 140%. Germany, United States. What is the difference? Not only that it is more expensive, but that productivity was lower in these countries than the cost of the labor. In these countries, productivity was higher than the cost of the labor. So even if they have good wages, they are still gaining productivity, they are gaining competitiveness because they produce more every hour, even regarding the fact that they get paid better. This is like, well, they produce more and they get paid better. My God, it sounds good. Because if you continue to be paid better and better and better, but you produce less, or less than the increase in your salary, your products are going to be more and more expensive, especially if you are expressed in the same currency. And also because the Americans are going almost in the opposite direction. The wages, the relative wages in the United States are falling, and productivity is more flexible. So this is a world that we have to compete in. So where do the inequalities come from? You say, well, inside each country. Yes, because some, because of the globalization, those that are more skilled, that are better prepared, but also in those sectors and in the areas which are actually where the productivity is growing faster than the wages. And technology can help very much by applying technology, by applying knowledge, by having a more skilled labor force. They can actually reduce the relative unit cost of labor and increase the productivity and then make it more competitive. So this is what is happening now. But what is happening now? I just want to leave you guys here very worried. This is my intention. Spain already unit cost of labor converging. Greece converging. Okay? Portugal converging. And France and Italy still like Johnny Walker, you know, still going strong. So this is going to create a gap. What is the result? This month, Spain has surplus in the trade and surplus in the current account. Now, let me tell you something. We cannot all be Germans, and we cannot all be Spanish. We're Italian, okay? So we have to solve our own issues here. But these are examples, and we cannot ignore them, especially if we are bound by the same currency, by the same rules of investment and trade, and by the same central bank. You know, so this is where they come from. So it's a productivity, it's a competitiveness, it's a labor market, is keeping your place in a highly competitive world. And just let me finish by saying the post-crisis world is going to be cutthroat world. The competition is going to be fierce because everybody is going to try to recover the lost competitiveness, the lost exports, the lost well-being, the lost jobs. So We just have to do better.
Parliamo proprio un po' di noi italiani. Lei ha ricordato che di recente ha incontrato il nostro Presidente del Consiglio Enrico Letta, che tra l'altro oggi pomeriggio sarà qui a Trento, e ha riassunto le raccomandazioni che l'OCSE ha fatto al governo italiano, implementation, attuazione, attuazione, attuazione. Ecco, ma proviamo a stringere in modo molto denso quali sono le riforme più importanti, proprio in una presentazione tipo PowerPoint, isolando le priorità, le riforme più importanti che l'Italia deve.
What do you think that Italy should do as soon as possible to tackle the two sides of the problem, i.e. competitivity and inequalities?
To start someplace, to move with the rest of the world means two things. First of all, you want to get the objective, that means you got to get the revenue, because here you have a double problem. Less growth means less revenue, but more people unemployed means you have to make more unemployment benefits. That means you have what you call double whammy. It's a pincer. From two sides, you increase the expenses. Or you reduce revenue, increase expenses. So deficit tends to go up. The second problem is that it's a question of competitiveness. If the others are moving in this direction, if they are lowering corporate taxes, they are lowering taxes on labor, it's difficult to remain an island, isolated, or having a very original tax system, which is not competitive with the rest. So this is one thing. Public services. This is another way where you can redistribute some of the services. Equal access to public services. But let me tell you something. Many times this question of equalizing, the worst place to play God with a social policy is with the taxes. Tax everybody the same, or reasonably the same, and then you take that and give whatever is needed to the poorest. But the problem is that you have all these privileges, exemptions, exceptions, the so-called tax expenses in the United States, the tax niche in France, etc. And they were put in the books 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You have to review whether they're still relevant or even fair or even necessary. That's another question. And there's a lot of money, even before you start to cut expenses or increase the taxes. There's a lot in there in the books already today that is not justified. And we have to take a hard look at that. But then I'm afraid to say you have to take a look at old-fashioned structural policies. What do you say to a country like Italy? Well, monetary policy, well, that's done in Frankfurt. And frankly, you're running out of room, United States is almost at zero. UK is almost at zero. The Japanese are at zero. And Mario has just brought it down to 0.5 from 0.75, so reduce the rates of the central banks even more? Not really. Okay, you can buy some bonds. But what do you do with, for example, then the alternative, fiscal policy? Oh, well, let me tell you, we already used that one. You say, oh, why? Well, because we had a crisis, you remember. A crisis in 2008, 2009. In many countries, -3, -5, -7, -10%. In Estonia and the Baltics, -20%. fall in GDP. And what did we do? Appropriately, we used expenses, deficit, to get out of the hole. Appropriately. It was the only way to go. But unfortunately, we have added 40% of the debt to the GDP ratio. So right now, we don't want more cheese. We want to get out of the mouse trap. So, no monetary policy room, no fiscal policy room. What do you do? What do you advise to the Italians? Well, we actually gave them a whole book. Mr. Letta only recently, two weeks ago. Yeah. And it basically said, take a hard look at your education system as to whether it is updated, whether it is producing the right supply for the demand that we're seeing. We have a paradox. Millions of young people unemployed and companies saying, I cannot find the talent. I cannot find the right people. Then they go and import some people from other places in the world, some engineers from India or China because they can't find the right talent. My God, it's a tragedy. Maybe we're producing too many economists or too many lawyers, I don't know. We need more engineers, more chemists, more scientists, more people who can really help the productivity. This is education, innovation. Do we invest enough in modernizing, but not only inventions, but also innovation in the government systems, innovation in the relationship between research centers, basic research centers, and the companies and the markets and the recovery and the investment in order to get started all over again. In many of the European countries, a researcher that works for the government would never be seen with a private sector person. In their life, they think it's a sin. You know? Because there's a certain logic that we grew up with for generations that were separate. And now, of course, if you don't go together, the companies and the governments, the companies are no longer able to afford the billions that you need to develop a new drug or a new this or a new that. And the governments, of course, have very tight budget. So if you don't go together, it won't work. And also because in the market, the signals, the governments have to be looking at things that are going to be relevant for the companies that are going to then take it to the market so that you're looking at relevance in terms of the type of demand that is out there that you want to satisfy. Competition. Competition. Can you have a haircut on a Monday? Lunedì il barbiere. This is a very modest, a bit cynical example, but doesn't mean, is the market open here? Here, Europe. Here, United States. Here, Mexico. Here, Turkey. Here, Japan. Can you invest freely? Is it competition that is driving the best inventions, the best investments, the best management, capital flows? But mostly, is it benefiting consumers who have the option of getting the best products with the highest quality, the greater number of choice? It is part of the democratic life. If we do not provide consumers with a choice, it's like restricting democracy, you know. They do not have a choice, the democratic in the consumption. And we have, I come from a country that is, you know, which progress has been curtailed for many decades because precisely of the lack of competition in many, many sectors. But the same, paradoxically, is true in the most developed countries. So in education, innovation, competition, flexibility in the labor markets, flexibility in the product markets, in the services. How about the tax structure? We have talked about what's going on in the world. Are we adapting fast enough in the tax structure? Is it business friendly? Is it labor friendly? Is it investment friendly? How about the health system? The single most important expense, and at the same time, the single fastest growing expense. Is that being well managed so that you don't have abuses, but that you have at the same time cover quality of the service, but also value for money at a time when you have these budget constraints that are so serious. Talk about the way we finance infrastructure. Of course, governments can no longer finance infrastructure, large infrastructure works, because of the budgetary constraint. How do you put together the packages to make it attractive for the private sector to come, but how do you give signals, pricing signals and assurances so that the private sector can come and join? Deregulation or regulation. I remember former Minister Brunetta. He was a very, very good client of the OECD. He took the question of deregulation very seriously. Also, Mr. Monti and his transition government, they took this deregulation. We actually participated very much in the Semplifica Italia decree, you know. We also participated in the Lavora Italia, in the Cresce Italia, and all these decrees. But I remember once I was invited, said, we have eliminated 7,000 regulations, or 10,000 regulations. And I said, that's fantastic. So I was invited to a bonfire. He said, what's that about? He said, we are going to burn the regulations. And I said, well, you know, I think it's a wonderful idea to eliminate the regulations, but the idea of burning books does not look very well, you know. It brings back memories of older times. So let's not do the bonfire. Maybe, you know, we can only eliminate the regulations. That's okay. That's okay. But there's regulatory. So these things are the problem with this is you say long term. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have maybe run out of the short term typical. Maybe today the best short-term recommendations are long-term policies. But if we explain them well to the people, to you, if the media help us, the universities help us, if the politicians are eloquent, transparent, and good communicators and good educators, they can make people understand that these things are not going to produce results tomorrow, but that they will happen. And that because of this, Italy or whatever country takes the decisions are going to be better, going to be more competitive, are going to be in a better place. So I'd say go structural. I say go social, because there are too many victims of the crisis out there. I'd say go green, because we are on a collision course with nature. And we have an intergenerational responsibility to change the course and go into a more sustainable world. And last but not least, we have to do some revamping of the institutions. So that would be the fourth leg of what I would call the new approach to the economic situation of today.
Grazie. Abbiamo pochi minuti perché i vincoli di tempo...
We only have a few minutes because we've got to be absolutely right on time. But one very last question is still possible, and I'll try and be brief. And I'll also invite you to give me a short answer. Austerity. Now, there is a classic criticism against austerity, which has already been very much debated during this conference, during this festival, and it comes from Keynesian economists. It comes also from the Obama administration that is telling Europe, you're making a mistake. Austerity policies should not be carried out during a recession. You are actually worsening your conditions. But leaving this macroeconomic criticism aside for a moment, because we'll probably hear it again and again, and we'll hear it pronounced by Obama in his meeting with Mrs. Merkel in Berlin or in the G8 meeting, to actually focus on another point you talked about when you talked about inequalities. The austerity policies, for what they actually are, for how they are applied in reality rather than on paper, run the risk of moving in the opposite direction to your recommendations. And by this I mean redistribution effects of fiscal policies. Well, difficult to be seen, because if we try and tax the rich more, Depardieu goes to Russia and goes and live with Putin. Apple goes to Ireland, where its real tax pressure is 0.05% by obviously gaining profit out of this, and the rich, disappear if we tax them. So in the end, tax burden doesn't really have the redistribution effect which was desired. On the other hand, austerity spending cuts often, in fact, weaken those policies you think are crucial to be able to contrast the structural causes of inequalities. We take away funds to schooling, vocational training, all those policies which instead should make our youth more similar to German youth, for example, in terms of professional talent. Our workers who have lost their jobs more re-qualified for the jobs of the future. I mean, all these policies, which in Europe are public policies, sponsored by public authorities, are suffering from the austerity. So doesn't austerity run the risk of actually pushing us all in the opposite direction to what you were saying?
I think this question of austerity against growth is a false dilemma. And I think it's Manichaean. It's good for discussions and for articles, editorials, or good for seminars. But that's not the way reality works. Some countries had to focus on reducing their deficits. Why? Because when you get to 160% of debt to GDP, even if you don't agree with Reichardt and Rogoff, clearly there's something wrong with that, and the markets start losing the confidence. It's not a theoretical or academic issue. If you have been there, here in Italy, you have had spreads of 500%. When you started with spreads of 35 or 40 cents. And it was because the markets lost the confidence. They lost the confidence in your capacity to decide, and then you started deciding things. They were doubtful about the capacity to decide on the right things. But then what has happened? You have been taking tough decisions. And where is the spread today? Well, it is less than half. Okay? Much more realistic in terms of the relative risks. So, the market is sometimes blind, sometimes stupid, sometimes shoots itself in the foot, but is not so completely blind or stupid. Eventually, things kind of get, more logical. And to those who do the work, there is always reward, not always immediately. And this is the case of Italy now. But that should be, for the case of Italy, a great stimulus to continue to do more work and more reform. Because you can see that this is going to have a very specific result in savings in the budget, which can be then dedicated to something else. But let me tell you something also about austerity. It's not a policy. Reducing the deficit is like what we do at home. It's what you do in a company. And it's also what you do in a country. Because you have to finance the difference of what you spend and what you receive. And the problem is, well, when you have 30% of debt to GDP, 50, 60, 70, Italy is around 120. Italy is a relatively high level. Italy really had no choice but to embark on a clear path of consolidation. Does this mean forgetting about the social aspect? No. The question is the mix. The question is the signals. If you have to be given 1 more year or 2 more years, like a number of countries have done, including Italy, to get to the targets, this is absolutely fine. Piercarlo was the first one to say this 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, recommend to the European Commission. Why? Because the reality on which you produced the program has changed. You produce a program based on certain growth assumptions. The growth is not happening. Then you cannot have the same program if the context is not the same. So you have to wait a little longer. But you don't change the target. You tell to the markets, to the investors, to the bondholders, I am going to get to the same place. I'm going to take a little longer. You have to understand. If the Germans are not buying it, the French are not buying, the Americans are not buying, the Japanese are not buying, even the Chinese are buying less. I cannot grow at the same speed. But I'm going to get there. And then to be even more creative and more ambitious in the structural changes and all these things that we have said that normally are identified with long-term. Now, but you again mentioned Germany, the young in Germany. What happened in Germany? Why does Germany today have less unemployment than before the crisis? Where everybody else is growing at 12.5%, 20%, 30%. Youth unemployment in Germany is perhaps 8 or 10%. It's also double, by the way, of the average. It's maybe in Germany it's double digit for the young, single digit for the average, but it's also double. But why are they? Well, because they have a culture. First, moderation in the wages for 20 years. Low or increases in the wages lower than the productivity increase. This gains competitiveness, which means German companies continue to produce and continue to sell because in the alternative, their products are good quality, but also the price may be more competitive. But what happens with the people who had to be fired? Well, they were not fired. This is what happens. They stayed in the work, Kurzarbeit. They were not fired. They worked less hours. They contributed a certain reduction in their income. The employer contributed a certain contribution to that cost by absorbing part, and the government also contributed because in the 1 hour, 2 hours that they were working less, they were being trained. They were being retrained. So it's not only Kurzarbeit, it is what you were doing in that Arbeitszeit, in that time of the work that you were not using. They were being retrained. They are going to become a formidable power because they are going to be not only competitive, but they are going to have more skills. And where does this come from? It comes from a culture of cooperation and dialogue between the unions and the private sector and the government. And that is not reinvented from one day to the next. I was invited by the government here in Italy to go and speak to the partners, the social partners. There was a table where you have the unions and you have the private sector and you have the government, etc. Clearly, many, not all, but some of the unions were acting as if this were a confrontational table when basically you were trying to find ways. Some of the private sector firms or leaders were acting as if there's you and us, you know. And even the government was kind of going into, like the referee, into a fight, where basically you were trying to solve a common problem. A common problem that had to be solved by definition by everybody chipping in. In Mexico, we have this game, you know, when you go, you blow, you move the top, and then it comes and say, you put one, or you put two, or, and then one of the sides, when it falls on the side, said, everybody put. Everybody has to contribute. Well, this is the only game when everybody has to contribute. And this is what was happening. Wage moderation and much greater public dialogue. Oh my God. Well, maybe then it's not so mysterious what is happening in Germany. And maybe it's something which we can do also. Last but not least, I don't think anybody in the US can come and tell the Europeans that they should get their act together. Because I have to say something, at least the Europeans chose the present course. It may be right or wrong, but they chose it. In the United States, economic policy is being dictated by lack of agreement, not by perhaps the wrong decisions. and you don't know if it's wrong decisions, right decisions that are being corrected. In the United States, we are subject to a mechanical set of formulae which were put in there precisely not to be used. And unfortunately, because of the polarization of the politics in the United States, is now being applied mechanically in producing 1 to 1.5% less growth than would have been the case if we had been able to pace the question, more appropriately. So I don't think anybody can blame, put the finger on anybody else. We all have to focus on fixing our own problems, but of course, hopefully through the OECD, you can take a look at the best practices. What has worked better in some places, what has not worked in others, and we're willing to help to make that happen. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Grazie anche
Thank you to Angel Gurria. Thanks to you all for the attention. I know it's going to be a busy day today. There's lots of meetings everywhere in the city, so have a nice day.